The sea pulled back like a curtain and left the shore bare and shining. People came out of houses in slippers and bare feet to see what the tide had shown. Stones lay where water had been, boats tilted on their keels. Children ran across the wet sand and shouted at each other. A small girl named Leela walked slowly because she liked to look at shells. She saw something odd half buried in the sand near where the water had been deepest. It was a flat round stone, no bigger than her hand. The stone had a line carved across it like a simple picture. When she touched it, the line glowed faint and warm. Lila did not scream. She only felt a small shiver go through her hand and up her arm. The light beat slowly like a heart. Far away, a lamp in a house blinked once and went dark, even though the power lines were fine, Lila called to her brother in a voice that had a smile in it. The stone answered back with a small flash that matched the sound of her voice. At the same moment, in a lab, a young scientist named Hannah watched a clean white monitor and saw the same pattern that the moon had made days before. Hannah worked with EEGs and sleep maps, and the waves looked like hills on the screen. Then the same steady pulse rose in the brain trace and matched the stone's light. Hannah forgot to breathe for a moment. She checked wires and reports. She thought it was a bad cable or a software loop. She told her colleague to run the test again. Pattern came back. The lab filled with low voices. People tried to explain with math and physics. They tried to say it was coincidence. Outside the town, fishermen found the seabed had changed shapes. New black rocks looked like they had been folded and hammered by a giant hand. A coastal road had a new hump where the ground had moved. An old map showed nothing there the week before. Teachers walked their kids to school and spoke softly about how the sea had behaved. People took phones and filmed the light in Lila's palm and sent the video out into the quick light of the internet. Comments spread like wind. Some people made jokes. Others felt a hollow like the sound of a drum in a canyon. A pastor in a small church prayed openly and quietly while the congregation on a weekday arrived to see the change to their town. The mayor called a meeting and spoke with tired, careful words. Scientists asked for samples. Soldiers asked for control. The news camera lights came like moths and turned the town bright at night. In a radio room in another country, a message fell into static and sounded like a child humming. A ham operator listened until dawn and wrote the hum down and taped the paper to his wall. Old men on benches who had watched the sea all their lives said the pull felt like a thought. They used the old words for storm and omen, but their voices were small. Lila kept the stone in her pocket and felt it warm her leg. She told no one at first because she knew grown people would make the story into a thing with rules and questions and men in coats. She walked the beach with the stone inside her fist and looked at the place where the water had sucked back. The sand was smooth and strange and wrote small lines like fingers across skin. At the lab, Hannah showed the IG pattern to a professor. He rubbed his chin and said the pattern matched nothing known but matched ours from the probe's log. The word wake still lived in the folder on Mira's desk. Mira had not told anyone the small way the readout had felt like a hand on a window. A different window showed the same hand. People who studied geology and those who studied language both leaned together at maps and screens and felt a thin thread pull. The carved line on Lila's stone looked like a language no one in the town knew. A young teacher drew it on classroom paper, and the children copied it as a game. One child traced the carved line and then sang something, only a soft sound, but strong enough to make the simple light on the stone jump. The song matched the pulse on the lab monitor and made a ripple across videos on phones. The more people watched, the more the pattern seemed to listen. Banks sent analysts, and a man with a clipped voice from a city office asked if the pattern could be used for power or code. An artist painted the symbol in bright orange on a wall and called it a gift. The artist's painting stopped staying still at night. It seemed to lean toward the window, and the paint looked wet when no one had painted it again. Conspiracy pages said the moon had been a library and the sea had become a key. The mayor ordered caution but also needed the money from curious visitors. A small crowd gathered at the beach at night like a slow wave, all wrapped in coats. Watched Leela hold the stone and the light that matched the hum on Mira's thin paper. Someone began to chant a word that was not a word, and the stone blinked in time like an answering light. Phones recorded everything, and the files moved outward, to places the town people would never know. In the lab, Hannah played the IG trace and slowed it until the pulse sounded like a single clear tone. The tone seemed to carry a shape of a syllable to the ears of those who listened on the speakers. For a moment the room held its breath, and then the speakers slipped a sound that was not quite human and not quite machine. It felt like someone saying a name across a long, wet field. At the beach, Leela felt the warm pulse push against her palm and then move up her arm into her chest, like someone tapping a quiet rhythm on the ribs. She lifted her hand, and the little light across the town rose in an invisible net. A bell in the church downtown rang, though the church door was locked and the bell rope hung still. The ring was one clear note, and it stopped, and the town heard it together. People looked at each other with faces empty of easy jokes. In a bedroom far away, Mira held the same printed line "Wake" and watched a live feed of Leela with lips pressed. Together, the paper burned a little into her fingers the way a warm coin might. Mira thought of old stories of guardians in rock, of machines that kept careful lists. She thought of how small the human hand must look to a thing that remembered. Long things the town waited. The tide began to come back in slow and certain steps. The sea rolled over its new stones, and the light in Lila's hand flared once like a small star. Then the light steadied, and the pulse matched the tone that Hannah had found. The world held a thin, wide, listening breath. Suddenly, the monitor in the lab printed a new line of text on the screen that none of the software had written, in a single simple word formed and filled the room. The probe woke at midnight on the dark side of the moon. It had slept beneath dust and old metal for many years. Small ping came from Earth, simple and routine. The machine answered and unfolded its thin listener. In a small control room on Earth, a tired engineer named Mira leaned forward. She wore a cheap headset, and the room smelled of coffee. Numbers flowed on her screen, and a thin line moved like breath. Then a low hum came through the speakers, soft and steady. The sound felt older than any machine in the room. Mira felt it, in her bones like a distant drum. The hum rose and fell like a far heartbeat. She held her breath so the sound would not break. Then the hum stopped, and the probe logged a single word. On the fragile readout, the letters were clear and simple. Wake. The feed cut immediately, and silence filled the room. The junior tech said it must be a glitch and tried to laugh. A manager asked about power surges and calibration errors. Mira, a small, cold thought climbed up her throat. She saved the file and printed the readout on thin paper. She folded that page and slipped it into her pocket like a talisman. She did not tell her father or her friend Kareem. Secrets feel heavy. When the world still moves as if nothing changed, outside the city lights blinked and people slept. The moon hung low and pale above the towers. It had been a clock and a story and a face to name dreams by night. Now it had done something the books did not teach. By morning, the signal would be a footnote and a few jokes online. At night, the sound lived inside her like a small bird in a box. The probe had been meant to watch and send numbers and then stop. It had not been planned to wake anything. But the moon had kept memory in its rock and old machines. It had saved signals and folded them like paper, and now it tested a small way of calling. Far away on a quiet beach, a fisherman walked by moonlight. He found a stone that fit his palm like carved black glass. The stone pulsed with light and warmth, and it beat in time with the hum Mira had heard. The sea near him sucked back as if someone inhaled and then rolled in like a sigh. He laughed at first, the sort of laugh people use to hold a strange gift close. Later, he would tell the story softly at the table while tea cooled. In a small university lab, a student watched a monitor in the deep night. She studied sleep and memory, and the screen showed tiny waves of thought. Then hidden in the lines, the same steady pattern rose and matched the probe in the stone. She called her professor, and they watched traces and tried to say it was random. A ham radio operator in a faded station tuned static and found a voice. The sound shaped into a single syllable that felt like a name from his childhood. He answered into the static with his own small voice, and the sound stopped. He sat very still and wrote the syllable down with a shaking hand. Old satellites that had drifted near the moon started to ping in the night. A mirror array tilted and caught a beam that traced a thin line on a map. Patterns formed in angles no one had made by accident. The moon had no mouth, but it had memory and ways to touch the world. It sent pulses that found living things and machines that could answer. It waited to see which answers were harsh and which were gentle. News feeds called it an anomaly, and the internet called it art. Conspiracy boards filled with loud colors and strange maps. Politicians asked for briefings, and ministers spoke in careful voices. Military officers asked about options with the calm that comes from practice. Some scientists asked to slow down and gather more proof before action. Fear wanted to strike quickly, and safety tried to hold a patience no one trusted easily. Myra kept the printed word in her pocket and felt its warm edge. She climbed to her roof the night after the feed and looked up. The moon was a thin white coin over the city, and it looked ordinary. She put the paper against her chest and felt its weight like a tiny key. She whispered a question that the wind did not carry. She did not expect an answer, and she did not want people to hear her doubt. The city below kept its ordinary sounds, and the moon kept its plain face. The first whisper had been sent, and it had been heard. It would change nothing at once, and it would change everything slowly. We would still go to work and wash dishes and love and forget. But a new feeling had crept under daily life. The feeling of being noticed. Signals that repeat become hard to deny simply by being repeated again and again. The pattern had touched a heart monitor, a radio, a stone in a palm. Mira kept the word close to her heart. Old machines that had slept in sky cemeteries woke like old dogs at a bell. Satellites that had drifted for decades blinked their eyes and sent small pings that no one had expected. A weather satellite changed its routine and turned its mirror. Plates to the moon as if to salute. A cluster of broken relay dishes on a quiet military outpost hissed and spun and found the same pulse that Mira had kept on paper. In a valley where students watched the stars, a forgotten telescope turned and caught a beam that was not sunlight. The beam moved like a slow finger and drew a thin, bright line across a map on a research screen. Amateur radio rooms filled with static and then with a chorus of tones that layered like a necklace of bells. The tones fell together and turned into a whisper that was almost a human voice. It did not belong to any language, yet it sounded like the shape of a name, an old ham. Named Tomas sat at his table, and the voice spoke a single soft syllable that his heart remembered from a long-lost summer. He touched the radio with both hands and answered aloud, because his hands wanted to answer before his brain did. The whisper paused and then matched the sound of his breath. Tomas said the syllable again without thinking, and the chorus bent and changed, and the tone traced over his name on the radio screen like a pen. On a farm far away, an engine on an ancient satellite stuttered and then began to sing a metal tune that rang through the night. A mirror array on the far side of the moon turned its panels with a care that no one had thought left in old rock. The array caught the tiny pulses and folded them into a beam. The beam found a path and crossed the dark like a wire of light. It touched a city map, and the light burned there cool and thin, and then widened into shapes that made a pattern of angles and circles no one had drawn. Engineers in a control room leaned over monitors and whispered words like pattern and archive and memory. They argued quietly and then more loudly. The military wanted plans and a map of power. The scientists wanted to listen longer. Mira watched all of this from her small desk under a lamp. Her thin paper with the single word "wake" sat beside her keyboard like a secret friend. She saw the map the beam had made, and felt the line of light like a thing on her skin. The beam did not strike like thunder, it stroked like a finger across a page. Where it touched the dirt in one desert, it opened a tiny hot seam that steamed for a moment. Where it touched the sea, the surface shivered and sent a wave that looked like a question. Old probes that had died on the moon suddenly answered calls, with tiny reports written in numbers that read like poems to those who knew how to read them. They spoke of layers of glass and metal and of mirrors set in places where no one had put them for any one human reason. People who studied old missions found plans that did not match any known program. There were symbols etched in metal like fingerprints. A woman who worked with languages sat in a dark hall and pressed her palm to a printout and said aloud that the shapes had rhythm and that rhythm might be memory. In a control room, a junior tech played the chorus of tones slower, and the tones turned into rhythm like a child's song. When the recording slowed, the song looked like human speech, and the room felt the hair on their arms rise. On the other side of the world, a small town that had nothing to do with satellites found its phone lines filled with strange calls and old messages that had no sender. Messages that had been lost years earlier reappeared on people's screens, with a light beside them. A mother in that town opened a message and found a recording of her own voice from when she was young. She did not know how to explain it, and so she wept in the kitchen and told no one at first. The moon's pulse seemed to find memory that people had left behind, and to fold it back to them like a hand passing a thing across a counter. In the radio room, the whisper changed. It started to say parts of things it had learned, like the names of small streets and the smell of old bread in a market. The ham operator Tomas wrote the words down in his hands, shook because one of the syllables matched a name that belonged to his brother who had gone away when Tomas was a child. He spoke that name, and the chorus bent and repeated it once more. The whisper answered back with a tone that was almost a laugh, and then with a note that felt like a question. People listening on phones and in labs heard the pattern and felt small as seeds under a boot. Some felt fear, some felt wonder, felt both at the same time, and that mixed feeling made their voices thin. A scientist with tired eyes named Hannah pushed her glasses up and sent a probe command to the satellite cluster. The cluster obeyed like a flock. It aimed a beam at a line of old mirrors set in a desert plain, and the mirrors shivered and built. The beam until it arced in the sky and then sliced down until it drew a map that matched a star chart from an age before the charts had names. The map lit up in bright pinpricks across continents, and then a thin wire of silver ran from the moon's face toward Earth and stopped just above a single town. The town was the one where Lila had found the stone. In Mira's small kitchen, the thin lamp hummed and her phone vibrated with a feed from the town. The camera shook. Someone shouted that the sky had a new line. People spilled into streets and looked up. Above them, the silver thread trembled like a held breath. A chorus on the radios fell to a single clear note, and the note became a single soft word that every ear tried to catch at once. Then the word changed into the memory of a door opening and a child's laugh, and a small, bright flash cut through the sky and the lights. On the houses in the town winked as if someone had switched them all for a single second. The feed died and all the screens went black at the same time. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been, and it felt like waiting for an answer after a question you had not known you had asked. A paper rose from a teacher's desk as if a small hand had lifted it. And for a long, slow moment, the class watched letters hang in the air like birds. Then the children squealed, and the teacher reached out as if to catch a breath, her fingers trembling where the paper had been. Outside, cars leaned like tired animals, and a street lamp tilted until its light painted the road at an odd angle. People felt their bodies lighter, and then heavier in quick waves. Plates slid on tables. A mug slid across a counter and stopped against a child's shoe, and windows showed faces looking up with mouths open. In the town where Leela kept the warm stone, a bicycle floated 3 inches above the pavement, and a dog lifted its paws and barked at nothing. A mother on the 3rd floor found her houseplant drifting toward the ceiling, then dropping back as if pulled by a rope in the dark. Drones sent to watch the moon wobbed and then failed to hold their positions. One came down like a stunned beetle and lay on its side blinking. Soldiers spoke in clipped voices and checked their straps and their boots as if the rules of steps had changed. Scientists scrambled with instruments and tape and maps, but the numbers on their screens danced and refused to be trusted. In a hospital, a monitor that had been steady began to show odd, slow waves, and nurses held a child's hand while the machine hiccuped. And a man in a control center watched his coffee float in a perfect circle above the mug and then slap back into hot brown silence. Phone calls dropped at the same second in pockets of the city and then came back in crooked, delayed bursts. People who had felt only curiosity the week before now felt under the curiosity, the cold teeth of fear. The mayor called for calm and asked for help. The scientists asked for time to measure. The military wanted a clear target and a plan. Stayed on her rooftop with the thin paper wake folded in her fist. She felt the small change in weight, like the moon was laying a finger on the world and testing how heavy a human could be. In schools, teachers tried to keep the children moving and safe while parents argued at doors. A teacher named Samin held up a paper plane, and it curved in midair and then landed on the child's head like a gentle answer. A young pilot watched his drone twist and wrote new code by hand while his hands shook. The sea near the town moved, in odd little waves that felt like someone tapping a rhythm on water. Old men who had watched weather for decades said the feel of the air was not weather but attention, and they sat very still. Prayer groups gathered quietly under the weight of small things falling back to earth. Some people locked doors and whispered. Others walked to the center of the town and set small candles on the pavement as if light could steady the pull. News anchors used steady voices while their screens behind them showed cars at odd angles and a child on a swing that barely touched the ground. The internet filled with shaky videos and foolish jokes, and also with people who posted the small facts of what had changed. Spoons that floated for a heartbeat. A mailbox that lifted and then slammed down. A tire that drifted away and then returned. In a lab, Hannah tracked the pulse of gravity pockets with instruments that sang back numbers like birdsong. She fed data into models, and the models bled into panic because they could not say why the pockets began or when they would stop. Soldiers lowered silencers and engineers taped sensors to lampposts. A team from the city arrived with a portable scanner and walked the street with a slow, nervous step, as if the pavement could bite. In the middle of that night, a church bell stopped half-ring and hung, and when it fell silent, the town felt the absence like a missing tooth. People reached for answers the way people reach for light when the power fails, and none came quick enough. Then, at the edge of the town, a child named Rafi laughed, the laugh of someone at play rather than fear. And the smallest change came back. For one perfect breath, the light in Lila's stone dimmed, and the paper in Myra's pocket warmed. And a new small line of numbers scrolled across a screen in the lab that no one had told the computer to write. The line read like a breath held out and then let go, and everyone who saw it felt at once that the moon was testing not just machines, but the weight of choice on the people below. The world came to a glass table that looked like it was built to hold secrets and not people. Cameras and cables crowded the room, and lights made faces look pale and sharp. And leaders sat with their hands folded like men waiting for a verdict. In that room, a translator with tired eyes leaned close to a speaker and read a line that had arrived in one slow, clear pulse from the moon. The words were simple and exact. "Show me." The words echoed in the hall like the sound after a bell, and the air changed. Some chiefs of staff closed their mouths and wrote orders. Others opened folders and wrote questions. Outside the building, protesters stood in small groups with candles and signs. And inside, a commander clicked a pen and asked if weapons were ready. A minister said the word test and meant danger, and a scientist said the word test and meant knowledge. Newspapers printed the line in heavy type, and feeds across the world began to play the same two words in different tongues. In a small lab, Mira watched the live feed with the thin paper she kept folded in her palm, and she felt the paper grow warm as if the word itself had weight. Hannah, with her hair tied back, argued quietly for time to listen and to learn what the moon might be asking for, but the room where the cameras could not see was full of whistles and hard choices. Advisors said we must be strong, and we must be ready to strike if the moon meant harm. Then a woman with a quiet face stood and asked the people in the room to think of a different kind of answer. She was an artist who had painted the orange symbol on a wall, and whose paint had seemed to lean toward light. And she said that the moon had asked to be shown something it could not make on its own, something that lived in small, risky things, called art and mercy and song. One laughed at first, and then the camera zoomed to a man in a suit who tapped his watch and said that songs do not protect borders. A young musician who had been brought in because the scientists wanted calm sound instead of weapons tightened his fingers around a guitar case and said that a song could be proof, because nothing in the moon's long memory could make a true human. Song music carried mistakes and hopes and the sound of people forgiving each other. The general looked at maps and said the moon could be a threat and a test, but the artist spoke of small, brave things: a child sharing bread with a stranger, a rescued animal set free, a hospital that had treated an enemy soldier without question. The cameras waited for a word that would decide whether to build a wall of steel or to build a bridge of voices. In the town where Leela kept the warm stone, people gathered in quiet circles and practiced small songs they had sung as children. They held hands that trembled in the dark, and some whispered the carved line as if it might open like a door. In classrooms, the teacher Sameen had children draw pictures of what they would share if asked, and their pictures were of hands and bread and open doors. Not everyone trusted the idea. Some called it softness in the face of the unknown and wanted the safe weight of guns. Others said the moon was not cruel and might only want to learn what made humans stay when staying was hard. On television, a panel argued for missiles and for messages in code. A little girl in the town wrapped the warm stone in cloth and put it under her pillow because she thought it needed to sleep. Mira and Hannah both received a message to come to the capital and to bring proof and to bring calm. The night before the vote, the world seemed to hold its breath, and people did ordinary things with the sense that ordinary might end. Ovens were turned off, and lovers held each other, and a mother read 2 pages of a book to a child who would not sleep. At dawn, the votes would be counted, and the choice would be sent up in light or in lead. The artist's voice returned in the halls with a simple plan: do not answer with a weapon. Answer with a risk that shows what humans are when they choose mercy. And art over harm. The room swallowed the idea like a bitter medicine. Some left to call generals. Some stayed and made lists of songs and paintings and small acts that could be put in a box and sent like a letter. The moon waited in silver distance, and the word "show me" hung like a question mark in the sky. They sent a song instead of a missile. The world had made a different kind of plan. In a glass room full of cameras and maps, the leaders had not agreed at first. But a small team took a risk and gathered things that could not be built in a factory: a child's drawing, a recording of a woman singing an old lullaby, a video of a doctor closing her eyes and letting a wounded stranger rest, a loaf of bread shared between 2 hands, and a file of memories chosen from people who agreed to share the small, hard parts of their lives. The song began in a quiet room where a young musician tuned a guitar and a child pressed a thumb to a chalk mark on a picture. Then hundreds of voices joined, from different towns and different languages. Some rough and some perfect. Some voices cracked with age, some bright and new. They did not try to be flawless. They let wrong notes happen, and they laughed when the song stumbled. The sound was full of mistakes and mercy, and it carried the smell of kitchens and the soft scrape of shoes on floors. In the control center, a technician closed her eyes and let the song wash over the room. The box that held the child's drawing was small and flat and wrapped in clean cloth. The memory file was strange, not the names of leaders or plans, but the small regrets and small brave things people had done when no one watched. They sent these things together, in light and in code, as if they were sending a letter and a hand and a promise. The satellite cluster that had learned to obey a slow command took the data and turned old mirrors until the sky had a thin silver thread. That thread reached down and hovered above the town where Lila had found the warm stone. people watched from the streets and held their breath so the town sounded like a single wide lung. The song rose like a tide, and the thread pulsed in time with the music. For a moment the world held a clear quiet, and the moon, which had been listening, moved as if to lean closer. The reply came not in thunder, but in a small motion that felt like an answer to a question spoken in the dark. The silver line drew closer, and then it folded into a thin sheet of light that lay across the town like a new river. Where the light touched the ground flowers that had been trampled, lifted, and straightened. A man whose hands had been tired for years sat up from a bench with fresh tears in his eyes. The warm stone in Lila's pocket flashed once and then became steady. On screens around the world, the pattern that had once only been a hum turned into a face of slow light, and the face was not cruel. It was old, and it was careful. The moon did not speak with words all at once. It answered in shapes and in memory, and in a small, slow sound that was almost like the wind through a flute. The memory file showed small things to those who watched: a child giving a borrowed toy back with a crooked smile, a nurse holding a stranger's hand while rain fell outside, a neighbor sharing an umbrella and then walking away without asking for thanks. The images passed like postcards. The moon held them like a hand holding an insect and looked closely. For a long bright minute no one moved. Then the moon chose. It did not choose war. It did not choose to leave. It chose to change what it had been doing and to teach. A thin seam opened on its face like a door. From the seam came a light that was soft and warm and full of small patterns. The light spoke to old machines and to young hearts. It touched memory and set it loose like seeds. Satellites that had been cold began to send small, helpful signals. Old weather instruments that had been misaligned found new purpose. The mirror arrays on the moon rearranged themselves and turned their beams not as weapons, but as lessons. Places that had felt empty found small tools appear: a clean well at a village, a lamp that would burn without fuel for a year, a book left in a language many had forgotten but which children could read as if the letters had been taught to them the night before. The moon shared things that had been hidden in its rock: thin, smooth plates with symbols that fit the human hand like a puzzle piece. People who held them felt a memory that was not theirs, and then a gentle push to be kinder. Some nations did not trust the gift. They wanted to lock it away in vaults or study it with knives and tests. Others walked into open fields and opened the boxes in the sunlight and let children touch the smooth plates. A scientist named Hannah wept when a little instrument in the box began to play the song she had helped send. But the instrument played a version that sounded like a child humming by a window. Mira watched all of this from a rooftop and kept the thin paper wake in her pocket until the ink warmed to the touch. She thought of small things and of big fears, and she thought of how fragile and fierce people could be. The moon's decision made some leaders angry, and some people hopeful, and many quietly afraid. The world changed slowly. Some places grew richer with help that came from the moon's hidden mirrors and old machines. Others hoarded and built walls and forgot the laughter of the song. But at the edges of those walls, children still learned the lullaby and shared bread with strangers. The moon did not explain why it had woken or why it tested them with Show Me. It offered a mirror instead. The mirror showed what the moon had decided it wanted to learn. From life on Earth, the small, brave things that no missile could prove. In the weeks that followed, something else began to happen. Small groups of animals, those that had once been wary of bright things, came closer to towns where the light had touched Earth. Seeds that had been dry swelled and split. Old machines that had been used for war found new hands and were taught to dig wells or build warm rooms. A thin net of signals linked scholars and farmers and nurses in ways that were new and odd and full of jokes. People told stories of a face in the sky that had read their small proofs and answered by giving them back ways to care. Some nights, the moon hummed, and the same old pulse would find a person who needed rest and slow the breath of a baby that could not sleep. Many questions stayed. Was the moon a teacher or a judge or a friend? Had it chosen them, or had it chosen to choose? The answers were not simple, but a truth settled in many hearts. Humans had shown a strange strength by choosing risk and kindness instead of blind steel. They had sent a song and a drawing and a memory, and the moon had listened. That listening changed things. In small ways and in large ways, the world began to move as if it had been given a second breath. People kept making mistakes. They kept hurting and healing. They kept being loud and small. In the end, the moon's waking had done something no one had expected. It did not fix the hard things. It only proved that a slow, brave choice could reach a thing as old as rock and make the rock answer with a light that let the living learn.
How to be a little kinder.